20 years on from the US invasion of Iraq, the nation's armed forces are a pale shadow of what they once were. The security apparatus is now dominated by several Shia militias, who operate outside the law and kill with impunity.
You can't have militias that don't subscribe to a constitution, that do not subscribe to the norms of an official military force whose basic philosophy is to defend the nation against aggression. If you don't have that, you can't build a state.
Collectively, these militias are known as Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, or the Popular Mobilization Forces. The militia was formed in 2014 after the terror group Daesh swept through northern Iraq and the country's armed forces were facing near collapse after retreating to Baghdad. Iraq's top Shia authority Ali Sistani issued a fatwa calling for mass mobilization to fight the terror group. Tens of thousands of fighters rushed to join a number of Shia militias, which were then unified under the umbrella of Al-Hashd and were later incorporated into the Iraqi armed forces. These militias existed prior to 2014, with many tracing their origins back to the immediate chaos which ensued following the 2003 invasion of Iraq. However, for many, their origins go further back, having formed as a result of the Ba'athist President Saddam Hussein's repressive regime and its crackdown on the Shia community. They were strengthened by Iran following the 1979 Islamic Revolution and during the Iran-Iraq War which followed. Iran provided the Shia opposition with refuge and a new base of operation. It also provided material weapons and training to fighters from the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq and the Dawah Party.
And from that emerged the first remnant, the first signs of what was then to become commanders and fighters and tacticians who knew everything that then needed to be learnt about inner city fighting, inner city guerrilla warfare.
With the Iraqi state collapsing after the US invasion and the army dissolved by the coalition, many of these figures took advantage of the vacuum and began creating private militias in parallel to efforts to form a national army.
It was quite easy to take over barracks, to take over military bases, to take over hangars full of military ammunition and put all that training to use, whether it be in terms of becoming bodyguards for personnel, or whether it became thereafter building what was then to become a military section within Iraq that is non-formal.
After its occupation, the US divided Iraq's political spheres into three factions: Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds. The division sowed the seeds for sectarian violence and the corruption in the new Iraqi political system. Political figures and factions all vied for power and control at the expense of building a functional state. The instability also opened the door for Iran to exploit the chaos and begin funding armed militias to expand its influence over Iraq. Very quickly, Iranian militias began to grow. The Mahdi Army, the Badr Brigades, Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, and the Hezbollah battalions. Every Shia political party or movement now had its own armed wing. While the US invested millions of dollars into creating the new Iraqi army, the systemic corruption now rooted in the Iraqi political system ensured the national army would remain weak and ineffective.
And when you have siphoned off tens of millions, hundreds of millions, you can appoint your own guards, you can arm them to the teeth. In fact, you can have as many as a small brigade, a small faction. So we end up with a scenario whereby we have several armed groups who protect the interests of whoever pays them. And whoever pays them might be a person, an individual, a politician, or some person of influence, or it might be a political faction.
As the Shia militias gained more power, sectarian tensions began to escalate. In 2006, the Al-Askari Mosque, a holy site for Shia Muslims, was bombed. Al-Qaeda was accused of carrying out the attacks, and Iraq descended into a violent sectarian civil war.
At the very start, Iraq was in a state of chaos, and it seems to me that many of those factions thought that this wasn't going to last for long, and that they needed to make as many gains and as much gain as they can in that particular amount of time, when there is literally no accountability, literally, and I mean literally, no accountability whatsoever.
the militias could act with impunity and began to employ death squads aimed at ethnically cleansing Sunnis from the Baghdad region. The Minister of Interior in the Iraqi transitional government, Bakr Jabr al-Zubaydi, was linked to one of these militias, the Badr Brigade, raising claims that the security services were operating the death squads.
BBC reports talking of every single day finding on average 60 to 70 bodies of people just thrown in garbage bins and on the sides of streets or in sewers. People were kidnapped for no reason whatsoever, and they were kept, tortured, mutilated, and then just their bodies thrown in the open air.
In 2007, an alliance of Sunni tribes known as the Sahwa worked alongside US forces to face Al-Qaeda in Iraq and forced it out of the Sunni provinces. However, following the withdrawal of US forces in 2011, the Iraqi government headed by Nouri al-Maliki disbanded the Sahwa and refused to integrate it into the security forces. Feeling discontent with al-Maliki's sectarian government, which was amassing greater control and power, Sunnis began to protest by holding vigils in squares in Sunni provinces. The protests were met with a brutal crackdown from security forces, which eventually led to clashes in Al-Anbar between former Sahwa fighters and Iraqi security forces. Daesh, which had reinvigorated itself fighting in neighbouring Syria, took advantage of the conflict to re-establish itself in Iraq. Despite outnumbering Daesh fighters, Iraq's national army crumbled and fled Mosul, leaving it in the hands of the terror group.
The emergence of ISIS was the perfect excuse for those militant groups carrying the Shia ideology to come together, find al-Hashd, and basically give al-Hashd carte blanche to do as they will.
The Shia militias exploited the resurgence of Daesh to expand their control and power in Iraq. Following with a fatwa issued by Sistani, the ranks of al-Hashd rose to more than 60,000 fighters, and they were also incorporated into the Iraqi armed forces, giving them the cover of legitimacy. While al-Hashd played a significant role in taking back territory from Daesh, it used its fight against the terror group to strategically insert itself into Sunni areas and pursue a sectarian demographic change. During the fight to take back northern Iraq from Daesh, many human rights groups accused the militias under the banner of al-Hashd of committing atrocities no less severe than those carried out by Daesh, including arbitrary killings and razing Sunni villages.
Unfortunately, what happened in the last 10 years was the emergence of Daesh, of ISIS, which led to an opportunity to rise, to create actual sections of armed forces that go parallel with the national armed forces and that are essentially militias. They have all the weapons, probably even better weapons that the army has, and they pursue an ideology. It's not just that they protect, it's not just they defend certain areas or sections of a particular city, but they actually go out and pursue new lands, new areas, new authorities, new powers.
Despite being formed under the pretense of fighting Daesh, al-Hashd continues to operate within Iraq after its defeat. During the 2019 protests in Baghdad, Iranian-backed militias targeted pro-democracy protesters and were implicated in a series of assassinations of activists, journalists, and public figures who criticized government corruption. 20 years on from when the Ba'ath regime was toppled by the US invasion, Iraqis have yet to realize their aspiration to build an independent and democratic state. But many now ask, can any nation building take place while the nation's security is in the hands of corrupt politicians and private armies?
So in a lawless country, which is governed not by mere lawlessness, but governed by weapons, by military gangs, driven, once again, and I emphasize, driven by this zeal of ideology and sectarian religion. You just basically can't have a state, can't have a future, can't build a single thing.